Hi everyone, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Welcome to the third installment of our summer series on global digital rights challenges. I'm Jess Peake, the Assistant Director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA School of Law, and this event series is co-sponsored by the Promise Institute and the Institute for Technology, Law and Policy at UCLA. As many of you have already heard, if you've already joined us for some of this series, the Promise Institute for Human Rights is the Center of Human Rights Education, Research and Advocacy at UCLA, and we empower students with enriching teaching and experiential opportunities in human rights law, engage with diverse frameworks and disciplines to generate new thinking on human rights, and advocate for change in coalition with academics, practitioners, and activists. We focus our work on 5 main thematic areas, including migration, race, accountability, the environment, and of course, technology. The Institute for Technology, Law and Policy is a new research center at UCLA whose mission is to conduct research and analysis to ensure that new technologies are developed, implemented, and regulated in ways that are socially beneficial, equitable, and accountable. On behalf of both institutes, I would like to acknowledge UCLA's presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. Today, we'll be discussing Life Interrupted, the impact of internet shutdowns. And our speaker today is Tomiwa Ilori, who will present on a recent report he authored for the Global Network Initiative. This report documents the debilitating harms of network disruptions in 11 African countries, and we'll drop a link to the report in the chat shortly. Tomiwa is a doctoral researcher at the Center for Human Rights Faculty of Law at the University of Pretoria, and his research focuses on a human rights approach to platform governance and online harms in select African countries. He also works with the Expression, Information, and Digital Rights Unit of the Center. His wider interests are on human rights and policy development with respect to digital technologies, international human rights law, and ICT 4D. Joining Tomiwa in conversation is Mark Verstraete, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at UCLA's Institute for Technology, Law and Policy. Previously, Mark held research positions at NYU Law and Arizona Law, and his work focuses on information law with a specific focus on the relationship between private law and the information society. His work has appeared or is forthcoming in the flagship law reviews of North Carolina, Illinois, BYU, Hastings, and Loyola Chicago. He graduated from Harvard Law School. So with that, Mark, I will turn things over to you.
Thank you, Jess, and thank you, Tomiwa, for joining us today. So just a quick sort of like roadmap for where I want this conversation to go, but as always, like I'm free for improvisation. So I want to start with the groundwork of the report, thinking about sort of like the descriptive elements, then moving to sort of some of the potential remedies that you lay out in the report, and then finally talking about some areas of communication that could be interesting. And just a note for our participants, feel free to drop any questions in the chat as we go. I can sort of shift the conversation in that direction. So basically, starting off, Tomiwa, can you walk us through some of the descriptive elements of the report? Basically, what are internet shutdowns? What sorts of distinctions do you draw between the different entities that sort of bring about internet shutdowns, and sort of what types of internet shutdowns are possible, and how this daily life for people in the countries of Africa who you surveyed?
Thank you so much, Mark, for your question. So quickly, to just brush through the basic descriptive parts of the report. Ideally, internet shutdowns can be described as in various forms, and there's been various definitions with respect to what they mean. But just simply put, as simple as possible, it's just not being able to have access to the internet. But there have been other, more elaborate description of what technical descriptions of what internet shutdowns are, and they've usually been described as intentional disruptions of internet services in such a way that they become inaccessible over a particular region for a period of time. So ideally, most internet shutdowns are not usually planned for. they are usually as a result, especially in instances where they've been used, they're usually as a result of political events. For example, to go, some reasons that are given by governments are usually that internet shutdowns are used to ensure that there are no breakdown of law and order. For example, during the public event like elections or mass protests. And we've also had examples of when governments decide to shut down the internet as a result of a national examination. So we have several reasons which governments use as basis for shutting down the internet. But in terms of the types, basically there are different kinds of shutdowns. So, and I will break those kinds down into two. There's the first category of you can categorize internet shutdown based on those who cause them, and you can also categorize internet shutdowns based on how they are carried out. So, for example, in terms of those who cause internet shutdowns, ideally the most popular ones are the governments. So the way it works is most governments don't go directly to shut down internet, but they give orders, for example, to the regulatory agency with respect to the monitors that regulates the telecom sector, to give also orders to internet service providers who then carry out the orders, for example, in shutting down internet infrastructure, and as a result becomes inaccessible. So governments usually are the main actors that carry out internet shutdown. Also, there have been instances where the internet shut down as a result, for example, of technical causes. Maybe there are cable cuts, undersea cable cuts, as a result of large ships. There are troughs that end up cutting undersea cables. And there are also instances of terror attacks, for example, that target critical infrastructure like telecom masts, and as a result has caused internet shutdown. So that is internet shutdown based on the causes of shutdowns. But also, there is also in terms of how it is carried out. So for example, typically, in some instances, it is just a part of the internet that is shut down. So what I mean by that, for example, it targets specific services online. So for example, the most culprit in that category is usually social media platforms. So you discover that the government gives orders that targets particular platforms to be shut down. And the reason sometimes given is national security, to ensure that there's no disruption of public law and order. So when you look at this particular categorization, the way it is handed down by government is usually super whimsical and arbitrary, because oftentimes governments usually do not have justifications for carrying out those shutdowns, and that is an example of when the shutdown is specific. But in some instances, the shutdown is broad, so it doesn't target just social media platforms. It targets just the entire internet access within that region and for a specific time. But the interesting thing about the way also in this part of the world, the way internet shutdowns occur is that due to the arbitrary nature, it is not well thought out. So there is usually no due process that goes into how the internet is shut down. So as a result, you really don't have information as to how it would last, or how long it would last. So most of the time, internet shutdowns go on unabated. I am aware that one of the longest shutdowns so far that has occurred on the continent has been 231 days, and that is Chad. I think that is Chad. No, Cameroon. The Anglophone region of Cameroon went without internet for more than 230 days. So, and also Chad has also done something like that, but I think that was super restricted to just social media platforms. And the one for Cameroon was the entire internet access for a particular region in the country did not have internet for that 231 days of thereabout. So when you look at this quick snapshot of what internet shutdowns are and how they are carried out and what their accounts are, you see that the idea from what I could see so far, the idea is to is information controls. Information controls in the sense that the government wants to measure and ensure or determine the kind and nature of communication that people have, when to have it and how to have it. So yes.
That's great. Thank you so much for giving a summary. I had a chance to read the report several times, and some of the descriptive insights are really fascinating. One thing I was sort of left wondering is, did you have an instinct based on your research on whether most shutdowns are targeted, or are they sort of focused at sort of the country more broadly? And how often are other techniques such as throttling used, or is it more purely about disconnecting specific sites, or even maybe shutting down access?
So from what I could see, I mean, especially when I was speaking with respondents for the report, is that it's not usually targeted, right? It's not usually targeted. It's usually as broad as possible, and as disproportionate as possible, and as general as possible. So there are hardly instances. I think as much as I know, internet shutdowns, the history of internet shutdowns in Africa was actually a little bit more targeted. Then, because there weren't enough or considerable pushbacks or calls for transparency and accountability in terms of controls, it grew bolder. And for example, the first censorship, online censorship that took place was in Zambia in 1996, and it was just targeting a specific website. And from there, since 1996, then fast forward to 2007, Guinea, then the 2011 Arab Spring, it became a thing. So it became a thing, and it grew bolder as a result of that. So it is usually quite super broad. And sorry, what was the second question you asked?
Yeah, so I also was wondering about you sort of answered it in your question, in your response, but I was sort of wondering about the use of throttling, whether that's a technique that's often deployed, or if it's purely sort of more clearly like shutdowns rather than just slowing of services. Rudolfo from the chat also has an interesting question. He says that in Latin America and the Caribbean, there are often power cuts that are often sort of, the corollary of that is of internet services. So did you see any sorts of, could you see governments enacting power cuts to achieve similar ends as, sort of like traditional shutdown procedures that you mentioned? So where the government takes an order to, regulatory bodies that demand sort of a cancellation of services. Could you imagine something similar, like using power cuts, or is that something that you didn't really come across in your research? So
interestingly, no, I did not. But personally, coming from a country that experiences power cuts a lot, there have been instances where there are, super large-scale power cuts, and that, as a result, affects internet connections, because the masts that connect to your phone are no longer accessible because they were relying on, the power generated publicly. But as a result, I think at some point that had to stop, because now the power was generated independently for each mast. In some instances, they run generators or use solar power to generate power for the mast. So as a result, as time went on, it phased out. So that is markedly different from what happens on the region. What happens on the region is super deliberate and very intentional. The order is usually direct. It's usually from the executive, which usually does not, run it through other arms of the government, like maybe for judicial review, then directly to an executive agency, who then passes the order down to the ISPs. So even if it was accidental, those layers of communications are intentional.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Another thing that I was sort of wondering about in the report that you sketched this out in a little bit of greater detail, but what exactly are the harms that come from internet shutdown? You mentioned like a loss of communication, a loss of access to information, but I wonder if sort of like particularities about life in Africa make shutdowns sort of different or raise like novel concerns. So I know a bit about sort of like, you know, this is mentioned in the report, but the rise of sort of like mobile like payments and other sorts of like technological advancements. Are these sort of particularly interesting in how they relate to internet shutdowns more broadly?
Okay, so if I get your question clearly, you're asking about the harms that are caused by internet shutdowns. Okay, cool. Yeah, so I mean, just on the surface of it, ideally, it just means that you are suddenly cut off from, you know, internet access. Just typically, like, you can't get information on online anymore. If there are services that you enjoy online, you no longer have access to them. But you know, thinking about it more critically, it is really way beyond that, because Africa as a region has the most youngest population across the world, and that means more demand also, you know, for, you know, smart devices, for internet connections and access. And that also, in one way or the other, means for disruption of ideas, disruption of innovations, disruptive innovations, which means most people, most young people now, you know, have to earn one way or the other and living online. So when, for example, the platform is blocked or an entire internet access is blocked in a particular region, you're not just cutting, you know, maybe leisure or pleasure for a community, a society. The means of livelihood is also completely cut off. So people who make living online, we have people who make trades or whose source of livelihood is basically online. And also considering the fact that, you know, the pandemic, the impact of the pandemic has continuously, you know, seeks to reduce human contact as much as possible. That means we then have to rely on digital technologies. And that also means, for example, a critical sector like the education sector has to rely on digital technologies. And when internet shutdowns occur, for example, teachers can't reach students, students can't reach teachers. And that means for as long as the shutdown goes on, and the education, the education sector for a significant part of it suffers. So, I mean, then, what is also sort of shows is how critical the internet access is today for not just Africans, everyone across the world. So if the harm is already on the surface of it, but the more we dig, the more stern and dire we find that these harms are. So yeah, so those are some of the things, some of the nuances that I noticed with respect to when I was working on the report.
Yeah, that's great. So we've sort of covered sort of the description of how internet shutdowns work, what they are, and the harms that are caused by the fallout from them. I'm sort of left wondering, so do we have any tools to combat them? Are there any sorts of legal remedies within international human rights law, particularly within sort of human rights law within Africa? And are there any sorts of other sort of non-legal or maybe even soft law approaches to combating internet shutdowns?
Yeah, so I'm going to approach your question in two ways. So there are the legal solutions that are available, and there are also the non-legal solutions that are available. Non-legal doesn't mean illegal. I just mean like it's not legal. Yes. So the legal solutions, like you've mentioned, is the international human rights law. And there are so many examples. There have been instances, several instances, for example, the Human Rights Committee, the Special Rapporteur on freedom of opinion and expression, the various mechanisms of the United Nations, especially its human rights system, have continuously condemned internet shutdowns. And interestingly, these systems also do understand sometimes that there are instances there will be need, for example, where it might be necessary to restrict internet based on super credible, very narrow and straightforward reasons, especially as established in international marriage law. But these systems have also continued to point out that internet shutdowns as carried out by governments currently are completely wrong and violate international marriage law for just a basic reason, which is that it is too broad. So there are these mechanisms for also provide recommendations, directions for states on how to navigate issues with respect to shutdowns. And one of the recommendations that I've made in the past is for states to direct restriction to a specific content and not to a general community. And that, that restriction also should be timeless. It shouldn't be a restriction that is done for life or something like that. And such a person should have opportunity for redress. So, and before all of this happens, there must have been at least a judicial review. So a court, for example, must give a go ahead before such specific content is restricted. So these are some of the directions that have been offered, especially under international marriage law. With respect to also, redress on ground, especially as far as I know there have been a lot of court cases against internet shutdowns in India. There was also one in Zimbabwe, which the court asked that. So the claim before the court was that the regulatory agency that the minister that ordered the shutdown does not have such powers under the existing law, and the court found for the claimants and asked the regulatory agency to restore access to internet. So I think that was the only case. I think there was also a case, maybe it's still pending, in Cameroon, also with respect to the Anglophone crisis, the one I mentioned earlier. So there are definitely legal avenues to seek redress, and those are some of those examples. And usually those claims are brought before, usually under human rights provisions in most countries' constitution. In instances where they've occurred in sub-regional courts and regional courts, I think there's just been one case so far before the African Commission for Women and People's Rights with respect to internet shutdowns. It didn't scale through for some technical reasons. But there's also been a case filed before the ECOWAS Court of Justice that was brought against Togo. And the decision, I think, was reached last year, and it was found against Togo that it violated the rights of the people, Togolese people, by shutting internet access without explanation. So those are pockets of instances where legal redress has been employed, and the court found in favor or against internet shutdown practices. In terms of non-legal redress, I mean, what immediately comes to my mind are circumvention tools. Using so immediately, for example, the typical example is that the internet throttles. You begin to see that the internet speed decreases. Then with time, some websites are no longer reachable. Then with time, no access. So with time, also sometimes when it happens, there's usually a build up to it. So people are encouraged to, be more aware, pay more attention to those build-ups, and also begin to then prepare, for example, like downloading a VPN, and also being careful for the kind of VPN that they download, that they can use then to access whatever website they would like to access. So in my mind, the way I thought I could approach the question was use both legal redress and also non-legal technical solutions, especially immediately when internet shutdowns occur.
Great. So you mentioned some other things like making sure there's adequate notice and adequate due process. Are these things sort of already provided for in substantive laws, whether it's national law or human rights law, or are these sort of tools something that states would have to agree on? And if that is the case, do we think that states have sufficient incentive to voluntarily bind themselves to these strictures about what sorts of processes they need to undertake before initiating an internet shutdown? And what role do we think that civil society groups can play in sort of lobbying for more rigorous procedural safeguards?
Yeah, so your question is packed, so I'm trying to see how I can try and quickly undo some of them. So in terms of whether there are existing solutions, actually, yes. With respect to international maritime law, like I said earlier, there have been some specific recommendations that have been made with respect to restricting content online. And those instructions are clear, which is, that as provided for order, for example, using the provisions of Article 19.3 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, it was clear as to the instances where states are allowed to limit, for example, the right of freedom of expression, including those expression online. But one thing I want to point out, which you referred to earlier, is whether states have enough incentive to want to commit, for example, to due process with respect to internet shutdowns. So it's a little bit tricky. It's a little bit tricky in the sense that, like you rightly, noted, states are the most, they are the ones that carry out this internet shutdown. So why would they want it to stop? But the interesting thing about this is that the most feasible thing right now is that the international maritime system, right, especially the United Nations, especially through its various mechanisms, the Internet Governance Forum, as the regional Internet Governance Forum, it's better position, to mainstream the major requirements of international human rights law into a set of guidelines that can form a basis for due process. So the international human rights law, most states argue that international human rights law is merely prescriptive and really gives specific examples in instances, for example, where national security there's actually credible threat against national security. So a state could ask, okay, so I know a terrorist is broadcasting information to this set of people, and it is likely to cause unrest, but you're telling me not to shut down access, which I know is their main means of communication, and you haven't given me specific ways to, keep that access open, but at the same time forestall the violence that's supposed to happen. So these usually are credible arguments by government, but so far, and I've also noticed that there have been various arguments that we don't need an extra body of rules or guidelines with respect to international shutdowns. The international law is enough. But the point you made earlier, that there is no incentive for states to want to make rights respecting laws with respect to international shutdown, is actually a very important point. So international human rights law system will have to step up. And in my view, I also made a point as like that in the report, that states will no longer have that point, that argument that they rely on, that they do not have a set of rules or guidelines to follow when there are credible threats to a national security caused by internet access. So the solutions are not really very super clear. I mean, they are not. That's not what I mean to say, but like, it's not. It is not an easy one. The solutions are not an easy one, but there are very clear direction as to how this can be approached. And like I said earlier, there seems to be like a gap between, applying international human rights law precepts to actual international shutdowns on the ground. So international human rights law system is clear. It just says, oh, you cannot limit access if it's not legal, if it's not legitimate, if it's not necessary, and it's not proportional. And if you meet a state, for example, a policymaker within the local context that is about to shut internet access, if you ask them they shouldn't do this based on international law, they will ask you, what does that mean? So that means that there's a need to contextualize those broad principles under international law to internet shutdowns and streamline instances, safe guidelines as to, like you said, ensure that there's due process that are carried out. And in some, conversations I've had in the past, I've had brilliant ideas that have, for example, requested that when governments are making orders for ISPs to shut access, laws should be able to empower ISPs to demand, for example, court orders from the judiciary. And together with that, the possible human rights impact assessment to be carried out with respect to the shutdown the government is wants to carry out. So, for example, if a government says, for example, an ISP should shut access to the internet, the law, the principle, or the agreement that has been made should empower the ISP to demand whether a human rights assessment, as impact assessment has been done. Okay, how much will be lost? How are you sure that this access that's supposed to be cut is actually going to neutralize the harm we're hoping would happen? Those direct and specific questions. So those are some of the ways I think we can walk through a solution, with respect to internet shutdown. They are not super straightforward, but they are also, we are not without direction. There are ways we can walk through this and ensure that, states don't continue to get away with arbitrary shutdown of the internet.
Yeah, you made a series of great points, but one thing I sort of want to push back on behalf of states, I can see them responding in a couple ways. So first, the one you mentioned was these sort of like broad precepts from international human rights law that it must be legitimate and legal. They don't offer much guidance. So what groups do you think should be involved in doing that translation work? And how can we give states more clear guidance about what types of threats are legitimate and what exactly makes a shutdown legal? So maybe something that it should be tailored as narrowly as possible, like directed only at particular websites rather than broad shutdown. Sort of what other sorts of specific concrete guidance would you suggest be given to states to make these justified shutdowns possible?
So with respect, and I also think I already touched on the first part of the question, with respect to how broad the international human rights system is. And that was why, and also, so the specific question was how, which, stakeholder should actually lead those kind of conversation towards a solution, or for example, how to, apply the international human rights law to a specific set of rules. Interestingly and unfortunately, this also cannot be done outside of states or states buying. So, but it has to be I would be very careful to say maybe a particular stakeholder should take lead, because it is better, to first, in my view, map proximate stakeholders that are involved within the internet, regulatory framework itself. And that will mean the government, the private sector, civil society, research and development, the international community, the academia. All these people would at some point, have to come together, bring their heads together. Then if it has to be government-led, it must be super open and as inclusive as possible. So I am very wary of, putting someone at the lead. But if I was going to be partial, I would really advocate that civil society gets at the forefront, though not necessarily imposed on the state, because states also have to be carried along all through the process. Every single line of the clauses must, be negotiated and be based on the overall interest of protecting human rights. But if I was going to choose, I would rather choose civil society for obvious reasons, because, they have also always been the ones, that are at the forefront on ensuring that, internet shutdowns are minimized and don't violate human rights. In terms of specific guidance, for government. So that is also why I think governments are also very, despite how problematic it could be working with governments most of the time in respect to these issues, government also would have to be as of like I said, in the process of making this work. So I'm going to pick just one because I don't want to get into much into the analysis of using the 4 criteria of the international maritime law and applying it specifically, for example, for a legal framework on internet shutdown. And you had asked something else earlier, that in what instances would internet shutdown be legal and all of that. And I also want to point out that sometimes the reasons given by states are not necessarily bad. In fact, most of them are legitimate under international law. So you have reasons like public order, you have reasons like national security. Those are legitimate reasons, trying to protect the rights of others. That is a legitimate reason. But the issue here is, under international marriage law, especially using that Article 19.3 that I referred to earlier on, legitimacy is just but one requirement under that article, which means there are 3 other articles that must be complied with. So when governments come and say we are shutting access as a result of a national security, no one has asked, is it legal, provided for by a clear and precise, sufficiently precise law. No one has asked if it's necessary. What exactly is the issue you are trying to resolve? National security with respect to what? So there's also no one asking the question about proportionality. So if terrorists are broadcasting through a particular social media platform, why shut access to all social media platforms and not that specific station or content or account? So it could be, so let me try and practicalize what I'm trying to say. So for example, if a particular terrorist organization is using a platform to broadcast message to the people or to an audience, possible to cause unrest or precipitate violence, that means there is a direct connection between that organization and terror and violence on ground. The offline and the online conversation or online presentation, it can be linked to direct violence offline. Now, that that platform has just one account of that terrorist organization, right? But what we usually see states do is that they jump several layers of restriction and ban everything. So if a terrorist organization is using maybe, for example, a platform to broadcast something, they would rather shut access to all social media platforms rather than shut access to just or require that social media platform limits or restrict broadcast or whatever from that particular account. So that platform is blocked, other platforms is blocked, and in some instances the entire internet is blocked. So you see that the requirements are cumulative and are joint, but governments always claim that if they've complied with one, and you can't comply with just one, you have to comply with all the 4, right? So the law says and, not or. So if it was to be or or, it means that any of the requirements could be complied with and it will suffice. The law says it is and. I mean, Article 19.3 says it is and. So, so in order for a law, for a shutdown to be specific and, to be legitimate under international law, to have been complied with under international law, it needs to be provided for by law. A law that has been carefully debated and it's precise as to what will constitute an instance of internet shutdown. And people who that law would affect have a fair understanding of what the law is seeking to do. And number 2, there has to be a legitimate reason. I mean, I've had reasons that I've had governments argue that they're shutting access because of fake news. That is not a legitimate reason under international law. Unfortunately, hate speech, yes, but not disinformation. Now, there is also, the requirement that what is the restriction must be necessary, which means that there is absolutely no other way to restrict or limit the harm that is coming or from a particular speech or from a particular online content. And the fourth one is that it has to be proportionate. Whatever internet shutdown that the government or restriction of content online that the government wants to carry out, it cannot afford to be overboard. When it becomes overboard, then it violates. It's no longer legitimate. It's no longer valid under international law. So it needs to be specific as much as possible. And it's not just it says that it's specific, you must show that it is specific. So you don't want to limit access of a particular account to, because it propagates maybe hate speech or terrorism, or shares child pornography, and as a result, then ban the entire platform or ban everyone else within the country from accessing that platform. I think that's a little bit problematic and overstretched. So I think I've been able to answer some of your questions.
Yeah, no, that's great. And it's really helpful to sort of get those 4 different conditions out on the board. One thing I was sort of thinking about in the third one, which I guess sort of speaks to whether the shutdown is necessary. You sort of mentioned that it's the only way to sort of offset the cognizable harm under international human rights law. So does this mean that if there is an alternative option that's incredibly costly, the state will have to pursue that rather than the internet shutdown? Is there any sort of like balancing or cost benefit to sort of think about whether the shutdown is necessary, or is it sort of like a purely absolute inquiry? So basically, if there is an alternative method, then the alternative method must be taken.
Yes. So there is always an alternative method. There is always an alternative method than total blanket censorship. Let me give you an example. I don't know if you're aware, currently Twitter is banned in Nigeria. And there have been several, allegations as to why it was banned. The official communication says that Twitter's activities threatens the corporate existence of the country. But the ban actually came a day after Twitter restricted one of the president's tweets that was advocating for violence, or it felt violated its own rules. So it restricted just that tweet. Now, a day after that, the federal government announced a total ban of Twitter and immediately requested that ISPs should block access to Twitter. Right now, officially, ISPs are not allowed to give access to Twitter. Now, in that kind of instance, the alternative that exists was for for the federal government of Nigeria to approach Twitter specifically and engage with it with respect to the tweet that was restricted and have a conversation about it. Because, Twitter has, the rule which Twitter used to restrict the president's, tweets has been there before the president tweeted. So it was a rule that has always been there. They just applied the rule, the algorithms applied the rule, as that's always been there. But rather than do that, which is a proper and a logical thing to do, the effect is minimal. It was just one account. It was just one tweet, not the entire tweet, just one that was restricted. And if the government felt aggrieved because of that restriction, they could have easily approached Twitter. Now, there were also comments from the government itself that it has repeatedly approached Twitter in the past, with respect to some of the activities and how it spreads disinformation. It even accused it of spearheading protests in the country. and that Twitter has not been responsive, but and then use that as a collective, the final reason to finally block access to Twitter. So which went back to the point that I made earlier, that there's always an alternative measure that can be taken with respect to internet shutdowns. So most of the time, it feels as if the governments try to use a gun to kill a fly, because at the end of the day, usually there've actually been studies, research that have been carried out over and over, and internet shutdowns don't work. Currently, right now in Nigeria, it's any other day on Twitter. It doesn't even really feel that people are still trying and actively trying to defy the government order, which means that whatever the government is trying to stop is actually really not stopping anything. People are downloading VPNs and having access to Twitter. So what I'm trying to say, in essence, is that number one, blanket internet shutdowns never work. And always—
both that they never work, and they're both blanket internet shutdowns would never be justified because there would always be a narrower solution. Is that also what you're saying?
No, I'm saying they never work. The reason why, let me explain why I say they never work. The reason I say they never work is that when governments come and give a particular argument or justification for their shutdown, for example, national security, to forestall terrorism, to stop crime, breakdown of law and order, it really never at the end of the day stops breakdown of law and order. People still go out and protest. The Arab Spring was a very good example. There was a respondent I interviewed from Egypt who also shared the same experience from the Arab Spring, that even though it felt like they were suddenly thrown into the dark, it was like knowing your own house, even in the dark, they still found their way around. So that's what I meant when I say internet shutdowns don't work. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I have a question about that point. Is sort of the efficacy of internet shutdowns relevant to the analysis under international human rights law? So if internet shutdowns won't even cure the harm that they're sort of targeting, do sort of courts, or should courts and other sort of decision-making bodies take note of their lack of effectiveness?
Yes, exactly, Mark. So that is actually a standalone requirement under international rights, which is legitimacy. So if a government comes and say it is trying to protect the rights of others, how? What rights? What is happening? So it is not an abstraction. It is actually a process where the government must explain in clear terms that if we don't shut access to this particular content, lives and properties are in there, will be destroyed, and will show credible evidence with respect to that. So it's not about someone just randomly waking up, feel threatened that they've been in power for so long, or feel insecure because of bad policies, and just and know that people will hold the government accountable online. Then you just feel that, oh, they feel threatened, and go to the court or approach the court and say, I have a reason, and that is my reason. I feel threatened as a government, and I think that's the reason why you should shut access to the internet. The court must be able to ask that what law provides for this, and what are your reasons for applying that law now, and is there no other means for you to ensure that this doesn't happen, and how are you sure that the internet shutdown you're about to carry out is proportionate in terms of what, for example, if students are cheating online in an exam, and you feel that shutting access to the internet at that point in time is the most proportionate step to take. I don't think that is right. That is right in the sense that it's not, for example, if we shut internet access in that particular community, not only the students stop being the only one affected, everyone living in that community stops having access to the internet. So as a result, you've casted a wide net beyond your own target and has tried to drag in as many people as you.
Yeah, that's a great point. Another thing that I was sort of thinking about that I want to ask you is about a potential workaround that states might undertake. So rather than going to ISPs and threatening them or demanding that they block access to specific websites or even sort of access generally, what if governments sort of, rather than using a stick, used a carrot with ISPs? They offered them some sort of lucrative contract or some other benefit for the ISP to block or throttle access to specific sites. Can we imagine any sorts of response to sort of this setup under human rights law, or even like, would there be any way to sort of combat this? Because I imagine, a lot of people would agree that private companies can regulate their communication services as they desire, even if their incentives are something created by the government. So how would we respond, and should we respond to something like that?
So the role of private sector, especially ISPs, with respect to internet shutdowns, is a little bit, used to be a little bit difficult and unclear for obvious reasons, economic reasons. Is because now the conversation now has to do with profit versus rights. So, and because most ISPs are businesses, they're just in the business to make money, it's very easy for them to agree with the government. And the reason also is that the reason why let me give again the Nigerian example. The reason why it was super easy for ISPs, it wasn't always just an ISP that made that statement. It was the association of all ISPs that made that statement. So, which points to something a little bit more sinister, which is that the government even doesn't have to dangle the carrot. The stick is big enough. And when I say the stick, the government award the license, right? It can be withdrawn at any time. The monopoly, the state monopoly of regulation is very strong. So what power does an ISP have against the government that gave it its license? But over time, there have been points and arguments that have been made against the laid-back attitude of ISPs. They just roll over when they get such orders. And the argument is this: most governments provide for critical infrastructure, and most of the time classify infrastructure of ISPs as their critical infrastructure because they play an important role in commerce, in communication, importantly. So the way ISPs have come to view themselves as completely useless in the value chain of regulatory processes is really, really uncalled for, because having access to a country's critical infrastructure is enough power to push back against any, arbitrary orders for example, as internet shutdowns. And it also doesn't make sense because whether we like it or not, ISPs also get super, affected by internet shutdowns. They lose money. People don't buy data. They don't connect online, and it's not like it's all rosy for them. But they try and play the long game so that they can keep being a telecoms provider, not just with respect. I mean, it is just like giving up one thing to get more. And this is, giving up, rolling over for internet shutdowns is one thing too many that an ISP can just roll over for. So the point I'm making in a nutshell is that now ISPs can't continue to roll over. They also hold a modicum of power against the government to push back. And it's not even like being completely confronted. They don't necessarily have to be confrontational with the government. They just have to say, this thing you're asking us to do, we've chosen not to roll over this time around. Please provide a clear justification under international rights law, which you're obligated to protect. And,
yes.
Please go on.
No, I was going to say that's interesting. It's like there might be a natural equilibrium that's sort of arising because ISPs have amassed more power and they lose money during total internet shutdown. So they may require something more targeted. So that way they're still able to operate sort of more generally, but may restrict access to specific websites, which then sort of more narrowly tailors the government's sort of shutdown request. So with this in mind, do you think this could be sort of thinking about these sort of natural profit motives, sort of like reversing some of the negative trends of internet shutdowns? Do you think we should focus more on sort of manipulating the financial incentives to sort of preserve access, or should we focus more on international human rights, or should these strategies be pursued in tandem?
That's a very useful question, and I will explain why. So, and before I go on, I will just give a very quick answer. We need to resolve, we need to resort to international rights law. And the reason why I'm saying that is because the point you made with respect to making economic arguments in order to push against international shutdown, especially from the point of the ISPs, this is a point that has always been constantly made. It has been made, for example, I don't know if you're aware, there is actually an on-the-spot live platform that calculates, how the impact, this economic impact of internet shutdowns on ground in all the countries across the world. So, for example, if Twitter is shut for 1 day in a country like, say, Senegal, the platform will provide you a live, using a couple of metrics, of course, like the GDP and all of that, and how the economy is performing, to arrive at a figure to tell you the economic cost. So, if an ISP in Senegal is requested to block access to a particular platform, it could be YouTube, it could be anyone, that platform gives you an opportunity to make an economic judgment as to what it means. So these resources are already there, but rather than for internet shutdowns to abate, they keep increasing, which means, in my view, I'm not saying it's not working. It is working because at least it's putting out there for the world to see and informing everyone on the debilitating impact of internet shutdown. But with respect to stopping internet shutdowns on the long run, it will work, but it's going to take a long time. And that is also an economic argument, which in my view, I don't think can continuously sustain the kind of solution we want. So in order for us to look for a more sustainable solution, we have to anchor it on something that is a little bit more obligatory, more formal, and as the sanction of the law.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, and really helpful thinking about sort of the relationship between economic arguments for sort of providing a bulwark against internet shutdowns and more formal restrictions. However, we're running short on time, so I just want to thank you on behalf of the Promise Institute at UCLA and UCLA's Institute of Technology, Law, and Policy for joining us today. For those listening, I also want to let you know about the next events. We will be joined by Sam Gregory of Witness, who will be discussing misinformation and synthetic media on July 29th at 12 p.m. Pacific time. So thank you so much, Tomiwa, for having this conversation with me. I personally learned so much about internet shutdowns, and I'm sure everyone else who joined the call today did as well. Thank you.